Hi, Gabby. How you going?
Hey, Paro. I'm going very well. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks for coming on again. It doesn't feel that long ago that you were on last time, but it was 12 months ago.
Yes, I think it was a little bit over a year. Yeah, but no, thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. Always having good fun when I have a chat with you.
Yeah, and I've always got new questions. I've always got some questions that I need answering. So it's perfect timing because I've got a race in a couple of weeks as well. So I just want to nail down a few questions about that too. So yeah, I mean, I've got a few questions written down. First of all, I guess I may as well just get started. And
Hmm.
the first thing I've got is about meat, and it's quite well known that people shouldn't eat too much fiber before running a backyard ultra. And I was wondering though, because I was looking it on the internet, and I found that meat actually doesn't have any fiber in it. So why isn't eating like meat, like sausages, steak, and things like that? Why isn't that like recommended before running a backyard ultra?
Ooh, it's not that it's not recommended, it's just that it's not the thing that will give people the best benefit. So the reason to, let's say, remove fiber, and often it comes fiber and fat, is the general recommendation before any race really, is because fiber and fat are two things that take longer to be digested. So when someone is heading to a race, obviously there is a concern of we don't want gut issues. So of course, removing fiber and fat is going to be helpful for that situation. Now, the reason, let's say, meat and any, I would say even animal product in general is not necessarily encouraged before a race is because the priority is carbohydrates, and meats are essentially they have minimal carbohydrate with them. So that's why it's not like it's a bad idea having them. It's just that it's better to prioritize other foods, like something that is higher in carbohydrate. The way I normally approach it, for example, if we're thinking of pre-race where we're looking at, okay, let's prioritize carbohydrate, I often suggest, look, let's eat the carbs first. And if you still feel like having something, please go ahead, have a small piece of chicken, a small piece of meat. That is all good. At the end, is protein, is helpful. But for 2 days before the race, it's not something critical. So if you don't have room for it, it's not a problem.
Right, okay. And if you do eat meat, considering that you should avoid fat, should you be eating like lean meat, like you said, like chicken breast and things like that, if you are going to eat meat?
Yes, ideally. So definitely not the best time to be eating fried chicken or anything like that. Same if it's, let's say, a juicy piece of steak that is quite fatty, probably not ideal because it will be more fat than that necessary. But if, of course, depends on the piece, right? Because if it's something that is not as large, then that's good. So it wouldn't be that much fat anyway.
Yeah, okay. So I noticed that you posted a really interesting post on Instagram a little while ago, no, actually not that long ago, but it was titled Beat the Heat. And it's particularly relevant at the moment because we're in the middle of summer and there's a backyard ultra called MVP starting in a couple of weeks that's typically run in pretty hot weather. Um, so I'm really interested in breaking down what you highlighted as the main pointers for beating the heat. The first one's pretty obvious. It's hydration, and you said to avoid more than 2% body mass loss. So yeah. So how can you go into more depth as far as hydration goes?
Yeah, definitely. So in this case, I mean, when we look at hydration, there are two key things that we need to look at. First is before you get to the race, you want to be as hydrated as possible. And of course, we want to get to what is called euhydration. So it means that you are, let's say, properly hydrated, because being overhydrated is also a problem. So overdoing it is a concern. Now, when we are, the reason to do that is because in a backyard ultra, in particularly when you are heading there for hours and hours, the likelihood of you losing fluids and not being able to replenish 100% of them is extremely high. So I would say almost everybody is going to end up with some state of dehydration. The idea is that by the time you show up to the race, you are not in minus. You are essentially at net. So that way you are starting as hydrated as possible. Now, something that is important to add as a disclaimer when we talk about that 2%, that is something that was established from the American College of Sports Medicine. And their guidelines around hydration recommend avoiding more than 2% of body weight loss for an individual to stay adequately hydrated or avoid severe dehydration, let's say. However, in this situation, in the way these guidelines are established, are for races that, let's say, are not going longer than a marathon. A backyard ultra, if you get to the marathon, you're just starting.
Yeah.
So it means that the longer you're going for the race, the more your body is also losing weight from the fuel that you are using. So the glycogen, the fat. So it is possible that someone will finish at more than 2% less their body weight, but not from dehydration, also from other factors involved. So here when we look at hydration, yes, it is key for beating the heat, for coping with the heat. The more I work with backyard ultra athletes, the more I realize that being on top of your hydration from the start is going to be a key factor in the later stages of the backyard ultra. So it's obviously avoiding that massive loss, but staying within that 2% could be a bit tricky because even if you're hydrating well, you could be losing weight from something else. And then you can end up overhydrating by trying to make up for that loss. So that's when it's important to be a bit careful with that.
Yeah. As far as making sure you're properly hydrated, I do hear people talking about the day before a race. They'll not only make sure they're hydrated by drinking a lot, but they'll drink a lot of things like Gatorade, which also contain carbs. So is that a good way of getting in some extra carbs as well as making sure you're hydrated before the race starts?
Yes, definitely. That's something that I often recommend when I'm suggesting a carb loading menu. I often suggest adding some Gatorade, Powerade. The reason I go for, let's say, those drinks and not saying the more expensive brands is because they are cheap and it's the carb loading. We don't need to be using your fancy products while you're doing this. But the benefit of doing that is that you are adding carbohydrate, you're adding fluids because yes, you are drinking it. The way you're adding this carbohydrate is way more gentle than having to add another cup of rice or another set of bread. So we add that balance of, yes, we still want the carbohydrate with the rice, but adding that sports drink is adding carbohydrates, adding fluid, and adding some electrolytes that will help with that fluid retention. So yeah, it's definitely a good strategy to use some of your hydration from those products. I'm not suggesting that now every time you feel thirsty, in the lead up to your backyard ultra, you should be just drinking sports drinks, but it's helpful to incorporate a couple throughout the day.
Right, okay. And how far before the race would you suggest a runner starts having an extra Gatorade or two?
3 days before the race, I will probably start with, let's say, if we're talking about a bottle, which is like 500 ml, I would say maybe 1 or 2 per day. 3 days ahead of the race is good. And the better if you are being mindful about how much carbohydrate you're getting. So doing a proper carb loading is going to be helpful. But even if it's a little bit loose, probably up to 1 liter, 1.5 liters from these could be helpful.
Yeah, very good. Now, as far as that body mass loss goes, I mean, do you recommend your athletes have scales with them as part of their race kit and weigh themselves periodically during their races?
Not to everybody, and it does depend on the athlete. So, for example, and I know that this is something that Chris Martin talks about with you. And actually, Chris got that tip from one presentation I did, and he decided that hydration was something that for him was quite critical, and that's why he's been monitoring that, and it's working really well for him. On the opposite extreme, for example, I last year was working with Andri, who is in Iceland. So in his case, the reason we were tracking his weight was because we had concerns of him overhydrating, because we're talking about really, really cold temperatures. And as much as he needs to drink fluids because there are some fluid losses, we need to be very careful that he's not overdoing it. So that weight scale there was to make sure that he was not over consuming the fluid. And there are other situations in which, for example, people who are really heavy sweaters and they struggle to hydrate frequently or hydrate adequately, it is helpful to have that weight scale there. So at least it can be a good reference in terms of, looks like we've been dropping some weight. It's important that we start catching up. So it's something that, because in a backyard ultra, there are so many factors that we need to be considering in terms of the, let's say, 10, 15 minutes you have for the break. The more things we can remove from that transition, the better. But in some instances, it's helpful that, let's say, every 6 laps or every 4 laps, depending on how far you're going, to at least keep track of how that weight is tracking, just to as a reference for how hydration is going.
Yeah, so it sounds like if you are going to use scales, you need to have a proper plan in place as what to do if you have lost more than a certain amount of weight. Like, unless you've got a proper plan of what to do, there's not really much point in doing that.
Yes, exactly. And the thing is that if you're going to have a scale, very important, please make sure you weigh yourself before starting.
Yeah.
Because then obviously there's no point if you're looking at the weight and it's like, well, this other lap was this much, but then it was, I don't know, I'm going to make up weight, 90 kilos, and then I was at 88, but then you don't know if maybe you started at 92. You're now 4 kilos down. So it means that it's 4 liters that obviously I will never ask someone to please in 1 hour drink 4 liters of fluid, because it's not going to work. So ideally we want to avoid getting to that stage, and that's why monitoring could be helpful. But yeah, weigh yourself beforehand. The other thing I didn't mention that also makes it quite complicated in these situations is that most backyard ultras are in a trail. Grass is really difficult to actually have a scale that can measure you properly. So if the surface is not flat and hard, it's not going to be accurate, and there's no point on using a scale. I know, for example, Chris comes quite well prepared. He brings a slab or something hard that he can put on the surface and use his scale there. So yeah, I think it's something to add to the mix, but it's not the only thing. Other things to consider is actually is a new, well, not new framework, but there's a framework that is called WUT. So W stands for weight, U stands for urine, and T stands for thirst. So keeping track of all three is a good way of assessing your hydration. With your weight, this one is recommended in terms of day-to-day changes. If you want to check, let's say, in the lead up to a race, how hydrated you are, well, you start and you weigh yourself. And if, of course, you're exercising, what you want is that the next day, ideally, you want to maintain that weight that you had the day before. If that has gone down, well, your task that day is to start increasing your fluid intake so that way you can come back to the weight where you were. That is one with the weight. With urine, what you want to see is that the color preferably is clear. It doesn't have to look like water, that's a concern, but as pale yellow as possible is going to be helpful. And with thirst, of course, if you are thirsty, it's very likely that you need more fluid. So not avoiding, but attending your thirst. So if you are monitoring all those things throughout the lead up, and also if there's a way of doing that throughout the backyard ultra, that is amazing. Because in a backyard ultra can be difficult to use all three, well, at least if we can keep track of two, which I would say urine and thirst are probably easier. And in the case of urine, you also want to see the volume. Now, of course, no one is going to be measuring it, but most people can have a good idea if it was too much or not, or too little. Usually, you can count seconds. Most people are familiar with how much for them is like a lot or not enough. So keeping track of those things is going to be helpful in terms of assessing how hydration is going.
Yeah, very good. The next thing was sodium loading. And this is definitely something I've never done. I haven't taken extra sodium before the start of a race before, but it was recommended between 20 and 30 mils per kilogram 1 or 2 hours before the start of the race.
So sodium is something that assists with water retention. So for example, in the case of that sodium loading, we want to make sure that we are, of course, drinking fluids. So yes, you're having that sodium, but it's also going to be helpful that you are drinking fluids beforehand. And what that is doing is that you are essentially doing a hyperhydration, and that is pretty much bringing you to that state where you are showing up to the race and you have that fluid with you that is going to ideally put you at, let's say, at an advantage, because you are ahead of the game before even starting. So once you start to lose some fluids, well, at least yours were not so down.
Yeah. And with that, would you say just a sodium tablet would be enough, or a meal containing salt?
Yes, so it can be as easy as a meal containing salt. So, for example, recently I was having a conversation with someone and they couldn't believe how much sodium there is in instant noodles, and it's like 1300 milligrams. So,
Right.
that's definitely plenty, right? And there are so many foods that are like that. Without you noticing, they are very high in sodium. So, it's a matter of, oh, actually, this thing that is actually high in carbs and works well, I'm happy to consume. Now, I don't know how many people would choose instant noodles as their pre-race meal. It of course depends on the time of the day, how the weather conditions and things like that. But 100% a meal could be helpful. The other thing that yes, the salt sticks or sodium tablets could be an option. In this situation, the benefit of that is that you don't have to consume something salty, as in like you don't have to taste it.
Mm,
So if you think, especially depending on how much sodium you end up having to use, having something so salty in such a short time could be quite off-putting and difficult to actually tolerate. So
mm,
using those sodium capsules is a good way of bypassing that. And that is definitely an option. There are definitely some products that are out there that are, let's say, well, they are electrolyte tablets that are also geared towards that hyperhydration, that they are quite high in sodium. You dilute them in your water. Normally, in this situation, is great because it means that you are having the sodium and you are drinking the fluid in the amount that could be quite helpful. So definitely, there are a few strategies, let's say, that someone can use. There's no one set. It's more about checking how much based on the range of the milligrams of sodium, and from there choosing which product for you will be the most suitable.
okay. So I was just thinking then, like when I'm at work, I'll always have a glass, like a jug of water sitting beside me that I just sip on during the day. And I've noticed that after lunch, I'll have sushi with a bit of soy sauce in it. And then, but after that, I'll go to the toilet less. And do you think that could be the salt helping retain water?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. So that is very likely. And the other question I have for you is, do you feel more thirsty after that lunch?
Yeah, yeah, because it's salty. Yeah, so I do drink yeah, a lot more. Well, yeah, well, it just tastes better when it's after a salty meal as well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. So yeah, that's something that obviously salt will do is, yes, you are retaining fluid so you don't stop to the toilet as often. I wouldn't suggest this as a strategy so you don't go to the toilet. It's more a byproduct of it because obviously your body is retaining fluids. And then you are also hydrating more because that fluid retention is almost pulling water from your system that your body is now asking more for.
Yeah.
Now, really, really important disclaimer. Make sure that if you, and goes to everybody, if you're going to do it, ideally under supervision, because it's something that, of course, for anyone doing the calculation, they will see that it's quite significant amount of sodium, that maybe that you look at it as well, like Italy, like I seriously eat this in when I eat instant noodles, so would it be a big concern? Fine. But if it's way more than that, just being careful in terms of like not going at it straight away. It's better if maybe starting with half of it and seeing how your body responds before jumping straight into the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Now, carbs, 30 to 90 grams an hour. Like, I mean that's something for all backyard ultras, but that actually helps with the like withstanding the heat as well, does it?
Yeah, it does, because something that is really important to remember is that our body, when we are do, uh, going through heat, and especially in a backyard ultra or in any ultra for that matter, it's going through a lot of stress. There is so much energy that our body is using in coping with this. So if we are not consuming the carbohydrate, it's going to make things even worse. The other thing that that carbohydrate is doing, or that energy consumption, is that it's also helping direct blood to your gut. So that is something that beyond the coping with the heat is also helping with GI distress. Because if, let's say, you are not eating and obviously it's hot, so your blood keeps going directed to your skin because it's trying to keep you cool, the blood flow to your gut is so severely compromised that you can even start getting tissue damage in someone who is there hours and hours. So it is something that by keeping the gut stimulated because there's nutrition coming in is going to be quite helpful as well. And of course, it's a strategy that is giving your body energy, is keeping your gut happy, it's helping for everything. Now, I'm sure that anyone listening who's been through a race that is really hot often most people find that it's quite challenging to eat
Mm.
because it's warm and it's sometimes the food is your mouth is already dry. It's really difficult to tolerate this. So that's when the strategy is really important, because if we start from the start and we are well hydrated and we are putting all the pieces in place, is way less likely that someone will reach to that point where they don't want to eat, especially because we have a nutrition plan accounting for this. Is a nutrition plan that is geared towards the weather conditions as well. For example, I would never suggest someone to have the instant noodles at noon in a hair dish like we do here, where it's quite warm, that Bacteria Ultra. So obviously we need to make sure that there are things that are cooler, that are making sure that the person is still interested in consuming them. And of course, that helps with the whole experience.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess when it's hotter as well, you're using more energy. So would you like say that you would like want to consume a few more grams of carbs per hour when it's hot?
Oh, that's a really good question. It is a bit tricky because for the same reason that there's so much going on, you also don't want to add more stress to your gut as much as you want to keep it stimulated. Boosting the carbohydrate just for the sake of let's see, because we are needing more calories, it could make it a bit challenging, because obviously the more carbs or the more nutrition we add, the more work we're demanding from the body. So I would say maybe a good way of looking at it would be like, okay, let's make sure that there are cooler drinks or something that just has some calories and is also supporting with that cooling effect, because of course cooling down and having some cold fluids, ice, those things are going to be helpful in these situations. But I wouldn't necessarily go for, oh, let's have more, because it could be quite challenging in a situation like that. It's just, let's make sure you have sufficient to start with, and compared to, let's say, other races, that where we're getting it from is adequate for the conditions.
Mm. I was just wondering then, I don't know if such thing exists, but I wonder if there's such thing as like a high carb icy pole, because that would be really good for ultra runners at a backyard ultra.
Yeah, so maybe. I mean, I was looking for some because, for example, Jeremy in New Zealand, who I was working, well, I'm still working with actually, he was very keen on having something that was like an icy pool. So we were looking for options, and it was unfortunately those massive like cyclone or something like that. That of course I feel like it would be taking so long to consume.
Oh,
So
yeah,
normally an icy pool will have like 20 grams of carbs.
yeah.
So I mean, it's still decent, but if we're looking at like from the whole icy pool getting a lot, it's probably challenging. Sorbet could be a little bit higher in carbs, so that could be a good option. And yeah, otherwise we should start getting onto it, Paro, and
Yeah,
develop our own.
yeah, we should.
Yeah.
Um, next, protein, 20 to 40 grams every 4 hours. And I think this may be something that some runners might not do as much because there's such a focus on carbs.
Mm. So this one is also similar to the explanation with the carbohydrate in terms of keeping the gut stimulated and also supporting the tissues. So that's why protein is something that could be helpful in these situations. Now, that infographic I posted was from a very recent paper that was talking about the strategies to cope in the heat. So there are some strategies listed there that they are, let's say, quite new, and let's say even though the evidence behind them is promising, it wouldn't be like, oh, this is the one. Obviously, as you said at the start, hydration is the leading one. But anyway, so when we look at protein, even one, coping in the heat, yes, is helpful. And the next thing, because we're here talking about a bacterial ultra context, something that is really important to keep in mind is that in a backyard ultra, most people are pushing to be there for longer they've ever been before. In terms of most of the time, not necessarily distance, but in terms of the effort the body is going for is longer than their body is used to. So that protein is supporting their tissue, including their muscles. So adding some protein as part of a backyard ultra plan is something that is 100% recommended. Because when we look at what is the objective that we want with a bacterial ultra nutrition plan, yes, we want the athlete to have energy, but we also want, and this is really important, especially as people are going longer and longer, that the body keeps performing as optimally as possible. And that's when other nutrients are required, like protein.
Yeah, I like using the protein, like the Tailwind protein sachets, because they're not a nice and easy option, especially at a backyard ultra. You just pour it in, mix it up with water, and shake it. That's how I do it.
Oh, definitely. And I do recommend, not necessarily it has to be Tailwind. There are other brands that have like their own recovery drink. And even
Yeah,
though it is recovery drink, as technically you're meant to drink this at the end of the race, it actually is really helpful during the race because it has carbs, it has protein, you just mix it in water. So it's a really good way of boosting that intake from time to time. I will never recommend this as the go-to hydration drink, but I would say, especially in terms of having that protein boost every 4 6 hours, something like this, especially if there's nothing else that has protein in that plan, could be really helpful.
yeah, yeah, very good. Now, caffeine was one that was on the list that I was a bit surprised about actually, because it was before, like 1 or 2 hours pre-exercise. So, I mean, I think some people like would be surprised to hear that would be also helpful with running in the heat.
Yes, so that one was more geared towards, in general, performing well. So the thing is that caffeine helps with that perceived exertion. So not necessarily that is helping your body cool down or anything like that, but what it's doing is that your body is experienced through that really hard effort because it's hot is not as bad as if you were not having it. So of course having some caffeine beforehand would be really helpful in situations like this. Now, a lot of the time when people recommend caffeine is the reason it's 1 to 2 hours beforehand is because there are recommendations geared towards, let's say, up to a marathon, which is, if we think of when the caffeine kicks in, is normally an hour after its consumption is when it normally peaks. It depends on what is the source of that caffeine, but let's say on average 1 hour it peaks. So it means that if you consume it before 1 hour before you race, it's peaking by the time you are racing, and it will last the effect for the duration of that race if we're thinking of a marathon. Now, if we're thinking of a backyard ultra, the situation is very different. So that is when in this context, it could be better to be a bit more strategic about the timing. And in that case, it will depend on the athlete, their goals, their tolerance. So that's when we can use it at different stages, but it's still something that I would recommend with the race being hot or not.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Yeah, so I mean, this MVP it starts at 7 p.m. So I'm going to try and last the night without any caffeine, and maybe start thinking about taking it the next day, but playing it by ear. And just you may be interested. I've also when I do caffeine now, I take no dose because it's the simplest way, and you know exactly how much you're getting, and you don't have to mix it up with. You don't have to, because I used to have it with my precision gel, but I found that after a while I didn't want my precision gel, but I still wanted caffeine. So that's why I think that no dose is probably the best way to go if you're going to have a caffeine plan.
Definitely. So when I look at caffeine, I often suggest options that are easier to measure. So
Mm.
yes, no dose is very easy because obviously you have a single capsule that you need to have, and you know that is 100 milligrams. With precision gels or Morten gels or those gels that have caffeine that are around the 100 milligram, very similar situation. That's what it is. Also, there are those caffeine strips. So that's really good. And in this situation, it's great that if you're already noticing that in order for you to have that caffeine, you have to have the gel that is not as enjoyable. It's like, well, I might as well have the caffeine separately, and you can have it with something else. Like, for example, you can say, I'm going to drink it with some juice or something like that. So at least you get some sugar that can help in that absorption.
Mm.
But definitely, it's a really good way of keeping it, yes, separate and in control. Because sometimes when we look at caffeine, one of the concerns is that if we're not looking at what has caffeine from the things that you are choosing, and you are just like, oh, this is caffeinated and I'll have this, and then I also have tailwind that is caffeinated, suddenly you have way too much, and that is obviously a concern as well. Yeah, and for example, if you're with this 7 p.m. start time, if you are confident that you are happy to stay without caffeine throughout the night, that definitely works. If you're happy with that, I would say the situation where I perhaps would suggest including it from the start is, let's say, you've been working the whole day, you are driving to the race, and you just didn't get a chance for a nap, and essentially is going to be you're tired already to start with, and by the time you're hitting your bedtime, you're already feeling like, oh, I wish I had that coffee or something. So in that case, I would say, why don't we start from the first get go? But because I know you have the experience, and it will be like, if you are, I would rather wait for the next, let's say, 16 hours or whatever you decide to do. That also works. It's very individual at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, you've got to be flexible as well. Like, if I am feeling really tired at like 3 a.m., I'm not going to have it just because I said I wouldn't. Like, I definitely will take it if I think I need it. And so I think it's important to be flexible too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I know there's this belief that the longer you push caffeine, the better. There's nothing to show that that's beneficial. The reason I would, let's say, leave it out is just so that way you don't need to overload your body with something else. But I don't think there's any benefit per se in holding on
Yeah,
till you are desperate for it.
yeah, sure. Now, creatine was on the list as well. I don't know much about creatine, but you said 5 grams a day. So, what is it, and how do people take it? Is it tablets or powder or?
Yeah, so that's a hot topic at the moment. Creatine is taking a second wind in the sports nutrition space. So creatine is a supplement that for a long time has had lots of evidence behind it in terms of its benefits. However, most of the benefit is in put is power sports, sprinting, weightlifting, those efforts that require short duration bursts. For example, team sports, there's also benefit in using creatine, because what creatine is doing is helping with that very quick energy. So for example, when we think of the energy systems, phosphocreatine is pretty much one of the first ones that your body will use. If you right now make a sudden move, if I ask you to sprint to the kitchen, your body is the first thing that is going to use. So of course, having that is helpful in terms of those activities. The reason it's getting a second wind because people are starting to explore whether in endurance is beneficial as well. And beyond endurance, also in general, for health, is been having some, let's say, benefits in terms of, for example, for concussions in contact sports. There's a benefit in consuming creatine. I keep mixing them up. I'm sorry. Creatine. And in the case of endurance, where we can potentially see a benefit is in muscle mass development. So that helps as well. If there are some sprints involved in the sport, could be helpful. And in this situation, which is what is listed here, creatine, what it does is that it also retains fluid. So when we, let's say, have this recommendation of consuming creatine in the lead up to a race, especially one that is going to be hot and long, it is an advantage because it means that you are retaining fluid, and what it's doing is that you have, let's say, some sort of hyperhydration as part of it. There are some papers out there suggesting that that's why creatine is not as good if we're looking, for example, a half marathon. I actually can't remember exactly what was the distance that was measured there. It was an endurance distance, as in like half marathon, somewhere there. And the results were detrimental because the person was carrying extra weight because of the extra weight from the fluid retention. But if I were to think of something where that is no longer going to be a problem because we're going to be doing something for so long, like a Backyard Ultra, it's not about who finishes the quickest, it's who's there for the longest. Potentially something like this could be helpful because that extra weight is actually water that your body is going to use and is going to need. So it's going to be helpful in this situation.
Right, okay, cool. So if it's good for people who are like lifting weights and things like that, does that mean a lot of runners do actually like lift weights to help with their running? So taking creatine could help in that way too, could it?
Yes, definitely. So the thing is that, and the reason I'm not, let's say, so strong about suggesting it is because there's still not so much benefit directly to endurance performance. But there are situations like, for example, if the runner is going through this phase where they are focusing on a strength, very helpful to have the creatine. If the runner is going through this stage where they are recovering from an injury, also helpful because if there's, for example, some muscles that they are not moving much because they are unable to run or to do particular activities, having that creatine is also going to help with that muscle retention. So it's a good idea to have it. And if it's, let's say, a general period where it's like, you know what, at this stage, I'm happy to have a more general approach where there's not necessarily a race in the immediate future. There is some benefits in having this. Why not trying it? So it's, yes, incorporating it and assessing how the body responds to it as well.
Yep.
Once again, under supervision, everybody, just
Okay.
important.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's definitely, there's some promising things there.
Yeah, yeah. So I've never been into one of those, like, there's supplement superstores and people work there selling all types of stuff. I've never been in any. I don't know if you have either, but the people working there, are they pretty knowledgeable? Like, if you went in there and saying, I want creatine, will they give you will they give you a lot of help?
Oh, actually, I've been to one shop. I think I've been to two so
Yeah.
far. And I honestly can't say. The thing is that when I went in is because I wanted to have a protein powder. And I remember the person when they were recommending it, they were talking too much about the ingredients. And what I wanted was, I just want, in my case, what I was interested is the flavor, because I'm not someone who is very happy with artificial sweeteners in terms of the taste. I just don't like it. So I was asking about things like that, and they were going off about other things. So I don't think it's just that everybody's like that. It was just something, in my case, it wasn't as helpful.
Yeah.
But technically, yes, they are trained in terms of having a general knowledge on things, but also in sales. So it is possible that you walk in about asking about creatine and you walk out with a bunch of things that they are telling you because you run, and then here's all the other things. So just being careful with that. If, let's say, I'm assuming you're asking is like, okay, what if I want one? How do I look for the best one? Things that if someone wants to get creatine, the first one is checking if they actually need it. So first is looking at, okay, what is my objective here? The next thing to look at is creatine monohydrate is the best option. You ideally want it in powder form because that will be easier to have the adequate quantities. And this is something that I encourage everybody who looks at supplements to please check. And it doesn't have to be just for creatine. It can be from a simple protein powder or anything else. Look for it to be batch tested. So there is a seal that is going to have, it says Inform Sport or HASTA certified. Those are the supplements that you ideally would like to get. And what it means is that those supplements have been checked against banned substances. Now, the reason these substances are banned is because they are, in many cases, detrimental for health. So you want to make sure that your supplement is clean. Even if you're not going to be tested, even if you're like, well, I'm a back of the pack runner, no one ever is going to come with an anti-doping test or anything like that. It is really helpful to look at this anyway. So I recently, because I'm working with a client who's going through some injury recovery, and we look at some brands. And from memory, I know that Musashi, Body Science, and I think Pillar Performance is actually just releasing a creatine. And all those three, at least from when I checked, were batch tested and were like ticking these boxes. So something to look at. If just to double check, if you are going to get it, just check that those things are there.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Now, nitrate pre-exercise. So nitrate's something else I don't know much about, but I know it's in beetroot. So what can you tell me about nitrate?
Yeah. So nitrate is essentially a precursor of nitric oxide. So what that does is it helps with getting your blood vessels wider, or like dilating them, I say.
Yeah.
So what it means is that your blood flow is quicker. So it's something that, for example, if we're thinking of, okay, we're coping with heat, in this situation, getting that vasodilation, that's the word I was going for, vasodilation. If we get this vasodilation, what it means is that the blood flow is flowing quicker, and it means that, of course, it's cooling down our skin. It's something that is helping in terms of cooling our body down. So that is a benefit there. Now, nitrates have lots of evidence as well in endurance as well, but for distances shorter than a marathon, because there is definitely a benefit in having something like this in those races, let's say, there's already there's good evidence behind them in how, in terms of time trials, and how like the person can essentially run quicker when they consume something like this, because of that vasodilation effect, where it's easier to have that quick blood flow. I personally, if I am doing a 5K, a 10K, or anything of that, like around there, or even half marathon, I definitely make sure I have my beetroot shot beforehand, because I do find that is helpful. Very important though is that nitrates is something that you don't want to have chronically, because eventually can uh, inhibit training adaptations. So it's something that if you're heading for the race, perfect, but not something you want to have before every training session, because that eventually is going to be not helpful for you.
Oh, and so I didn't quite understand why it's not helpful if you have it too much.
So it can inhibit your training adaptations, essentially. So because when we think of training, the role of training is to stimulate things in our body, essentially a response that to tell our body that something needs to change. If we're constantly having this, let's say, thing that is already vasodilating your blood vessels, is essentially giving you that extra aid without telling your body that this adaptation needs to occur during your normal training, so your body naturally is good at having that efficient blood flow. So that's why, yes, that extra kick before the race, amazing, but we have it every single time before training. We're just essentially, it's like having someone lifting the weights next to you, and you think that you're amazing at lifting these 20-kilo dumbbells, and actually someone has been helping you all the time, and now when you have them on your own, it's like, oh, these things are really heavy and I just can't lift them. So let's say similar situation.
Yeah, okay. And I guess it's a little bit like a lot of people won't have caffeine in the week leading up to their race as well. So because if you have it too much, it wears out the effect come race day.
Well, that is actually a myth.
Right, okay. Yeah.
And actually, I should say, disclaimer, I love coffee so much. Maybe that's why I'm like a bit
Right.
biased.
Yeah.
But no, seriously, there's already studies showing that in the past, we used to think that having this, let's say, caffeine washout was helpful. So that way, by the time you get to race day, having caffeine will actually kick in properly. But now what we've seen with research is that if someone is already a habitual coffee drinker, they get benefit from caffeine exactly the same as someone who is not. So essentially, you don't need to have that washout period or anything like that. The only thing, and I think I can't remember if I said this here, but I do often talk about this. The main reason why I would recommend someone not having caffeine, especially the 24 hours before the race, would be so they can sleep better, because it will stop you from sleeping well. Even if you're a regular coffee drinker, still will have some interference in your sleep. And if, let's say, it's a race that is starting very early, or it's a race that you've been training for so long and you're so nervous, things that could make it worse for you to actually sleep, it's helpful if you are okay, let's remove this stimulant, so that way at least I can catch some nice night good sleep the night before.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Now there was the last one in the how to beat the heat category was tyrosine. I haven't heard of tyrosine before.
Oh, so that one was definitely among the maybes.
Yeah.
So that is an amino acid, and essentially it's very weak evidence with that one. I would leave it as like the last one. Let's say if someone is very worried about performing in the heat and they're trying to tick all the boxes listed there, I would definitely leave it as like, okay, if I get a hold of this, I'll try it. But first, I would suggest implementing one by one before getting to and seeing how that benefits your body, because it may not be the same for everybody. Hydration, as we said, is an obvious one. Please, everybody, make sure you're well hydrated. But as you're going through that, especially in that order that we've been discussing them, the benefit specifically for this particular context starts getting weaker and weaker. So that's when it's like, okay, let's see if this is something that I can benefit from. For example, if I come back to the nitrates, if we're having those beetroot shots, some people respond negatively because it can upset their gut. So that is something that I would say, even though you don't want to be having it for training chronically, please have it for a training session before you head to your race and have this, and you're sprinting but to the toilet instead.
Yeah, I found that beetroot actually isn't that good for my gut. So I try and avoid it because so I've just learned over time. Whenever I eat beetroot, I go to the toilet. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So when Phil was on the podcast last, he mentioned that he's added eating Cocoa Pops with chocolate milk to his race nutrition plan. So, I mean, you're Phil's nutritionist. So, have you broken down Cocoa Pops with chocolate milk's macros, and what are your thoughts about Cocoa Pops with chocolate milk in a backyard ultra?
Yeah. So this is something that I know. I'm sure Phil mentioned that he got this from crewing for Sean,
Yeah.
and I actually that was his combination. Like essentially, Sean was eating Cocoa Pops, but Phil was the one suggesting, "Why don't we have chocolate milk with it? Like let's supercharge this thing." So something in terms of my opinion on it, uh, I think is wonderful, but I think it's wonderful for the following reasons. One is something that Phil in particular is enjoying a lot. He looks forward to having this. So when we're looking for a food in a Backyard Ultra, that is a massive winner. Something that someone is going to be happy having. Because when you're there for so many hours, eventually things start getting not as appealing. So having something like that is a winner, amazing. Next reason, full of carbohydrates. Yes, maybe the same reason why I would tell parents to perhaps not suggest Cocoa Pops as the first breakfast for their kids. It is the main reason why I would say in a Backyard Ultra, please make sure we have Cocoa Pops there, because it's something that, of course, is sugar, is helpful, and it's in this situation is going to be great, is carbs. When we add the choc milk, well, we're adding two extra things. One, we're boosting even more carbs because that choc milk has also more sugar. And we're adding protein. So that protein, as we have mentioned, is also going to be helpful. So we have a winner here. We have something that is carbs. It has definitely sugar. It has protein. It's moist. It's something to look forward to. So it is definitely a suggestion that I say. Maybe not for everybody. Maybe not everybody will enjoy that because it could be very sweet. But it's definitely something to, if someone is keen to explore. And since already Phil revealed his one of his favorite foods,
Yeah.
that is a potential option to consider, especially the part of getting moist, because that's something that also for some people eventually when the food is too dry, it can be very difficult to actually consume it.
Yeah. Well, ever since that podcast, well, one of the first things I did after that podcast, I went out and bought some Cocoa Pops, and I've been having it every morning with chocolate milk. And I get out of bed. I love it. I get out of bed for it. And then I go for a run. So I'm going to add it to my nutrition plan at MVP in a couple of weeks, and I think it's going to be. The one thing I will say though is to be careful if you do have it for the first few bites, because that not all the Cocoa Pops are moist yet, so they can get stuck in your throat.
Yeah, definitely very important. And
Yeah.
that is another thing to consider, right? Because, for example, someone who is doing a Backyard Ultra and has 5 minutes to eat, Cocoa Pops is not a good option. Why? Because you have to be eating with a spoon. You have to, like, in that case, that person is probably swallowing the thing. And that's when it's not something that I would suggest as the best option. For someone who will have more time to consume it, definitely way better.
Yeah. Is there any type of chocolate milk that you think is best? I mean, I drink Rokeby chocolate milk just because their marketing is everywhere and it is delicious. But is there any type of milk that you suggest?
Not really. I know that Phil is very pedantic with his choc milk. He has it has to be this particular one when he's talking about it.
Right.
But that is probably the main thing I would say. Choose the one you like. Now, if you are someone who has no issues with dairy, and when I say no issues, as your gut responds okay to it, and also no issues because you are someone who is comfortable consuming it from whatever belief you have in terms of you are not vegan or anything like that, then definitely dairy chocolate milk would be better, mostly because it will have more protein. If you have concerns of certain nature, that's important to then look at what is a concern. If it's from a 100% dairy tolerance, then soy will be the next one. Now, every time I suggest soy to people, they make a face, and that is because maybe it's not the most pleasant one. I personally haven't tasted chocolate soy milk, so I don't know if maybe this one is better because it's sweeter. But the benefit of soy milk is that it also has more protein compared to all the other milks there, like almond, oats. There are rice milks like quote unquote, and those are really low in protein. So in this case, if what we want is that benefit of protein, well, the soy will be the better. If what we're looking at is like, well, is a flavor, is something moist agent to mix with the Cocoa Pops, then it will be like, okay, just choose whatever you prefer, and you will be happy having. I know that, for example, the ones that I have compared, which is Oak and Masters, huge difference carbohydrate wise. So Oak is way higher in carbs than Masters. In one situation, it means that Oak is fantastic. In some other situations, it could be like, oh, that's maybe too much for someone who is not tolerating as much carbs, so maybe Masters, and it probably means that it won't be as sweet. So it will be, I would say, choose the one you like. Is at the end of the day.
Yeah. Have you looked into Rokeby much or?
No, I haven't, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's very similar in between. Because what did you say you like about it? Was
Oh, it's just delicious.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it maybe it's very closer to oak. I'll check it out at the end. Yeah, but
Okay.
very likely. So normally, when we're looking at a chalk milk, protein per cup of milk, we're talking about 8 to 10 grams of protein usually, and carbohydrate wise, regular milk has 12 grams usually in a cup. In a chalk milk, we're looking at 20, sometimes even 30, depending on which is the chalk milk that we're looking at and how much sugar and generous they were with that component there.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I know you keep your finger on the sports nutrition pulse and you keep up to date with all the science and things like that. So are there any emerging trends in sports nutrition that you think could go mainstream in the future?
Ooh, very interesting question. So, well, I hope like a few things I'm noticing. One, as I mentioned, with for example creatine, and there's another one that is bicarb soda. Those are supplements that have lots of evidence for power sports, for team sports, for things that are short duration. And I see that there are some people in the endurance and even ultra endurance space testing them. Now, not because I think they are going to be mainstream, it means that they are going to be good. With bicarb soda in particularly, I have lots of doubts that is actually going to be the revolutionary thing that people are expecting, mostly because the way physiologically the way it works is actually not something that in an ultra endurance uh, environment will give massive advantage. It's mostly for people who are at that peak where they are reaching that extra 0.01%. That's where it's like, okay, what else can we do here? But of course, from there it catches on and everybody wants to try it before working on that foundation. So the other thing that I think is I see, and maybe that's because I am such a huge advocate for, but I do see is getting better and better, is that awareness on how nutrition is beyond let's keep you at certain weight or let's keep you lean. Now people are understanding how powerful nutrition can be, how it is an asset when you work well with it, and it can essentially boost that performance. So that is something that I'm seeing is getting better and better in terms of people understanding how you can have that strategy that can maximize those results for you. So I hope that definitely becomes mainstream.
Yeah.
But it's something that I can see there's more and more awareness these days in how beneficial looking at nutrition from that perspective can be.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was something that I've taken in a few backyard ultras. And I know I think I've heard you talking to someone else about this on another podcast before as well. And it's Imodium. I got the impression you're not a big fan of people taking Imodium during races, but I have in a few just because going to the bathroom has been an issue for me before. Um, so do the negatives outweigh the benefits?
Ooh. Potentially, but I would say in more in a long term situation. So the thing is that Imodium, the
Mm.
way it works is that it slows down your digestion. Essentially, it locks your digestive tract, and that is because it's often taken for someone who's having frequent bowel movements, aka diarrhea. So what we want is to slow down things, right? We want to almost, let's say, close the tap from there. So that's the effect that Imodium is causing. But because it's doing that, my issue with it is that because you lock the system, now getting energy in is going to be very difficult because essentially now your gut is pretty much very locked. So the problem with that is that now, yes, potentially that frequent toilet stop has been reduced, but you created a new problem, which is now you're not absorbing your nutrition. Now getting things in is quite challenging.
Mm.
So that is where I say is not something I suggest using. So the thing here is that, unfortunately, for someone who is already in that situation in a race, there's not that many things that you can do at that point to fix it. So that's when it's like, oh, well, if this is the last resource, and if the medical already said, okay, have this thing as like an option, then, well, maybe it will give you an extra couple of laps that you can go through because you don't have to be stopping so frequently. But if someone gets to that point, I would say, please, before the next one, look at your nutrition. Look at what are the things that you're consuming that are potentially creating this situation for you. In some instances, it's not necessarily how the race plan went. It's about how in the lead up to the race, and it's beyond fat and fiber. There are other foods there that we need to look at to avoid the person, especially if they have a sensible gut, to avoid getting this situation again. So that's why it's something that I do discourage from using. That's something I see often in group forums where for runners, where they make a joke of it. It's like, oh, I have this. Which one do you recommend? If you know, you know, and things like that.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it's something that it is essentially putting a patch on something that, without looking at the deep cause of it.
Yeah, okay. Just a question I've just thought of then is I do take magnesium tablets one a day for no reason other than I hear it relaxes you and makes you sleep well at night. Um, but I also hear that it can increase your need to go to the toilet. So would you suggest maybe remove the magnesium maybe a week before the race?
It doesn't hurt trying it, yes, because magnesium is something that definitely can trigger those frequent bowel movements. And in this situation, I would say, yeah, probably try it in a week before the race and see how your body responds. You probably, if you're noticing from those first few days that the situation is improving, then it's likely, I wouldn't say that was the only thing, but a big thing that is 100% within your control to avoid consuming in that lead up.
Yeah, okay. And if someone does take Imodium during a backyard ultra, should they also pivot with the types of foods they're eating from that moment?
Ooh. So that is a strategy that I've never used with anyone. So I'll say no comment, just because I honestly, it's not something I recommend using. So that's why I don't have a a strategy to use in terms of how we approach the nutrition from that angle. Uh, if I were to say anything, it would be like, let's try and use things that are really easy to digest, very probably gearing more towards the liquid nutrition, very, very gentle, knowing that the system is struggling. So it's like, let's try and essentially drip feed from there and see how the person is responding.
Yeah, okay, very good. Now, Sean Lyons was a recent guest on the podcast and he talked about how he makes his own energy gels. Have you done much experimenting with making energy gels?
I haven't done it myself, but I know a few people who do, and I personally love it. I mean, first, it's a budget-friendly option, right? It's way, way cheaper than buying. I would say, depending on what you want to get from it, what the benefit of the brand is that it's reliable, right? It's something that you know it's at the right ratio, is crafted with ideally the best situation where there's not going to be any cross-contamination or anything like that. You know exactly what you're getting, so that is something beneficial. Of course, you have it in a package that is easy to carry, etc. Like, if you can afford it and also you can be bothered trying to make your own, fantastic. But making your own, what it also does is that it helps you be in control as well. So you know how big your energy gel is going to be. You know what you want to add to it, whether you want to add some flavor or remove it, especially if you know what you're doing, right? If you know that what are the things that you want to get from this, it potentially is something that is not a bad idea, especially for something like in this situation, is a Pacta Ultra. If this is something that he's consuming quite frequently, well, it's definitely helpful to have your own so you don't have to be investing so much on a branded product.
Yeah, because like 15 gels is close to $100. So It's a lot of money for
Mm,
15 gels. It's a lot of money.
yeah.
What are some good ingredients that you would, if you were to spend a week making your own like Gabby gel, what ingredients would you experiment with?
Ooh, so I mean, one it's maltodextrin, which is of course a type of carbohydrate, which is very popular in energy gels. Glucose powder. The other one is also, for example, even using something like honey or maple syrup. So it depends what you want. So, for example, if someone wants, let's say, I'm going to say quote unquote a natural gel, that's where you will be like, okay, let's work with lemon juice and honey and try to mash banana or something like that, or the maple syrup. If we're like, no, actually, what I want is the perfect ratio of glucose, fructose, and I want to make sure I have a very good awareness of how much sodium it has. That's when it's easier to go to the powder things. So we go to the maltodextrin, the glucose, and those other ingredients per se in terms of getting that right ratio. Now, because I haven't done it myself, I couldn't tell you exactly what ratio you are looking for, but there are different things that, of course, is helpful to consider, such as, of course, if you're going to add sodium, it can be as simple as just adding a dash of salt, and you're already getting some sodium there. If you also want to add other electrolytes, there are some other salts that you can consider as part of that mix. So yeah, it is, I would say, definitely for someone who knows what they are trying to achieve from it. And the other thing to consider is if you're going down the, let's say, quote unquote, natural route, being mindful that you need to be careful with what you're adding because you want the gel to keep and you don't want it to go off. So it's very important that as much as it's a lot of sugar and obviously will help, depending on what else you're adding to it, it could be quite a concern if that is not kept well or anything like that.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to rock up to race day and it's all moldy.
Yes, definitely not. That wouldn't be a great situation. That in that case, the $100 in energy jails were like the cheapest thing you could have done.
Yeah. So Gabby, I posted, as you know, I posted on Instagram the opportunity for people who are listening to ask some questions. Then I did get a few, and I got some good ones too. So the first one is actually, we did actually touch on this. It's about creatine. How long before an ultra should you cycle off creatine?
Hmm. So creatine has, let's say, a protocol where there's a loading phase, a maintenance phase, and there is a offloading phase on creatine. Now, my experience with creatine in ultra endurance is quite low because it's not a supplement that I encourage for everybody to use. So once again, it depends what you want to achieve from it. So in this situation, because there is benefit in terms of creatine helping with that fluid retention, I probably wouldn't stop it before the race. I would stop it during the race because then there's no point on keep having it while you are racing. So it will be like, okay, in the week, let's maintain it. And then as we are racing, that is your offloading period because there is seriously no point in consuming it during the race for this context. So that will be probably the advice. The other situation in which I would say offloading at some stage is when you are chronically consuming it for so long that it's helpful to have some break from it. But definitely, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. The next question is variety necessary if you are hitting all your macro targets from a couple or one single source?
Well, that definitely will depend on the individual. Something that I talk a lot about when it comes to backyard ultra nutrition is that to me, a key thing to think of when we're thinking of, I mean, from my experience, nutrition, but even when I have conversations with people, almost everything for a backyard ultra, when you're thinking of it, is consistency. In a backyard ultra, you are not there to be the fastest, you are not there to be the strongest or anything like that. You are there to be the most consistent in terms of you are there for the long game. Most people, right? I imagine at some stage someone is going to start making challenges in terms of let's see who can finish as many as possible on their 40-minute lap or something like that. Okay, cool. That situation is different. But in this situation where we are like, who is going to be the last one standing? And it means that most people are there to see how long they can go for. we need to think of that consistency. So when we think of that variety, it is pretty much to the individual. So I would say for whoever asks this question, if you are confident that by having those two things, you can go for as long as possible and you are sure that you are not going to have any issues of flavor fatigue, go ahead. The other thing as well would be to consider is the nutrients that we were talking about. So if we're talking about, yes, carbohydrate, protein, even fat, because here they are talking about macronutrients. Yeah, that's great. But there are other micronutrients that from the variety could be helpful having, especially if we're looking at, I always say talk about where we talk about, for example, other electrolytes. Often I only focus on sodium, but that is because my assumption is people are having other things that often will have the other electrolytes in some degree. If we're sticking to the same thing over and over, then we're missing out on many things. So that is where it could help to have that variety. But the last thing as well, and this is like essentially the devil's advocate, is, well, what if this person has zero crew, only has an esky, and they actually came from over east or whatever? Actually, well, probably the most consistent they can be is with just those two options, because they are reliable, they know them well, they don't have to have much handling. So that's why I often say it depends, but it's definitely something to do an assessment and decide when you are looking at your plan, what does consistency look like for you? What is something that for you can see you can be doing for a very long time?
Yeah, excellent. Now, the next question, someone wants a rundown of food for all your athletes at the SAT Champs. What did they eat? I mean, you don't have to, maybe just the interesting main things.
Actually, yeah, that's a good one, because I shared that post of the athletes I work with, which were 8 athletes, and when I put it together, I was like, oh, I should have asked them, like, list your favorite food, because I'm sure most people would have thought it was quite interesting. So I'll try and remember at least one from each of them, because I also interviewed them at the SAT Champs. So Andre, he likes having popsicles. So I talk about how he's in Iceland and it's really cold. Well, he actually loves having popsicles, like ice pops, even though it's so cold. So for him, it's helpful. With Aaron, he loves chisels. So that's one that definitely is in his plan. Dan Kamak, he definitely has a variety of things, but one of the things he likes a lot is baby food. Phil Gore, that's a secret, I will say. With Phil, actually, 2 new discoveries. So one was the Cocoa Pops and the other one, burritos. He actually enjoyed those as well. Narchi, also burritos. That's probably she started them before Phil, so she definitely enjoyed those. With Jeremy, I wouldn't be able to point one specifically, but I'll say that definitely the wraps were like sort of like the burritos were something that he started to enjoy more. And I think I'm only missing. No, I have Tim Kaprasak, who said that rice pudding is something that he enjoys, and Jennifer Russo, probably there were some like soups that she liked. So yeah, as everybody can hear, I guess, is that it's a variety of things. There's no single thing in terms of, and it's very much on the athlete, the circumstances, and obviously how they can essentially work on their nutrition based on who is helping them and everything else.
Yeah, unreal. Is it possible to have too many electrolytes when competing in a backyard ultra race setting?
Yes, absolutely. And that is something that I actually, when you were asking about the trends, that is one that is getting sort of quite intense at the moment. Almost every, not yours, but almost every other podcast is talking about electrolytes. And I say podcasts that are business, general health, like everybody has their sponsor that are electrolytes. So the issue with that is that as helpful as they are, because they are definitely helpful, there are situations in which it's quite easy to overdo them, especially depending on which product you are using. So there are some out there, especially one very famous one that sponsors so many podcasts, is 1,000 milligrams of sodium per sachet. So That is quite drastic. It's something that I'm not suggesting to many people, even in a backyard ultra context where they are there for so long. So it is important to be careful in terms of where we're getting those electrolytes from, and know that even though everybody says, oh, these salt capsules or these electrolyte tablets are so good, if you are not aware of how many milligrams of sodium you're already getting from the nutrition you're already having, it is very easy to overdo it when you start piling up products like this.
Right. Okay. Um, Now, this is just a question I just thought of then in regards to MVP. I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm thinking of doing something a little bit different where I'm going to take Tailwind with me out on each loop in a handheld. But when I'm back in my chair between loops, I plan on drinking a mixture of water and coconut water. And
Mm.
that's just to stop myself from getting flavor fatigue from the Tailwind. And I also love coconut water as well. So um, I know coconut water has electrolytes in it, but would it have too many electrolytes in it? Would I have to worry about drinking too much coconut water?
I would be more worried about drinking too much Tailwind because, for example, Tailwind is something that is really high in sodium.
Yeah.
So, do you know how much you're planning to, like, you have that flask? Are you expecting to finish that flask in a one loop or to spread it across a few?
It depends. Like if like during the night time, I definitely won't be drinking a whole flask each loop.
Mm,
Maybe 300 to 500 mils each loop, I reckon.
mm,
When it gets hotter, I reckon. Well, it depends how hot it is on the race day. I might be drinking up to an hour, a liter an hour, but that would be a mix between in my chair when I have the coconut water and when I have my and when I'm out on the loop.
mm. Yeah. So, for example, if let's assume that you finish that flask, which is it will be 600 milligrams if you are mixing that Tailwind correctly, let's say, or as they recommend. Coconut water will have, I believe, like 200 milligrams of sodium. That is not too much. So we're still like 800 milligrams an hour, especially if we're getting to that point where it's hot and you're drinking more. Then I wouldn't be too concerned. It would be more about if, let's say, you have that and then you also have a Vegemite sandwich, and then on top of that, you decide to have other electrolytes. So that's when it's like suddenly it's more and more. So just being aware of how much. I would probably, because your coconut water will say how much sodium it has. Sodium is one of those things that by law it has to be listed in all foods, so it's very easy to be aware of how much sodium you're getting, especially here in Australia actually. So have a look at that and just be aware of, like, okay, if I were to finish a whole liter, how much sodium will I be getting? And if you are, let's say, in that, I and this is very important, I'm not saying that this is the rule, but at around 1000 milligrams max, I wouldn't be too worried. But that's where it's also important to be aware of how much fluid you're drinking,
Yeah.
because it's possible to do the electrolytes, especially if we're doing more capsules and there's no fluid intake, and that is also a concern. It's like, okay, we're piling up on the electrolyte, but the fluid, which is essentially what needs to go with it, is quite low, and that's where this imbalance occurs as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, another thing I'm thinking about, I may do, like I might take just plain water out with me on a loop when I'm really thirsty and mix it up with coconut water. That's what a friend did in his last backyard ultra. He would take it in turns. He'd take out water in a handheld one loop and coconut water in the next loop, and he really liked that. So maybe
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because something that often, like, especially with Tailwind and these, let's say, very strong electrolyte drinks, which, by the way, they are not that strong, but when you're there for so long, it actually gets quite sweet,
yeah,
is that having a break from it is really helpful. So adding coconut water, plain water is helpful, especially for that flavor fatigue. So it sounds good to have like that mix there with you.
yeah, yeah. Um, Okay. Now, the next question, what are some hydration? This is probably a hard one to answer, but what are some hydration numbers your athletes have per hour in a backyard ultra?
Oh, that everybody's called like wanting the secrets. So actually, hydration is one that is very difficult, and that's because the way I work with all of my athletes is drink to thirst. So there is no number I can tell you because I don't know it. I don't. That's not something we prescribe. I can, and actually not off the top of my head, but I can easily list the grams of carbohydrate and sodium and calories, protein that everybody's having, because that's something that I wouldn't say meticulously, but quite closely keep an eye on and calculate. But hydration per se is one that is something that, depending on the race conditions, for example, I'm fairly certain that if Andre was here, he would be drinking easily 4 times the fluid that he was having in Iceland. And that is because obviously just the weather is, even though it's the same individual. And so that is something that it is very, very personal, but it's very important that drink to thirst and being aware of your sweat rate can be helpful, so at least you have that as a reference in terms of how much fluid you're likely needing.
Yeah, yeah. Something I just thought of then actually was I've noticed that when I'm sweating a lot, when I'm running, I'm actually feeling that's when I actually feel the best. Like when I'm not sweating as much, I'm often not feeling as good. Could that be because I'm not as well hydrated when I'm not sweating as much?
Yeah, very likely. So, sweat is something good for our body. The
Yeah.
reason we sweat is because sweat is a mechanism we have to cool down.
Mhm.
So, I'm assuming in this case, when you say I feel good and I feel good, similar weather conditions, right? Like it's not like
Yeah.
you are happy if it's warmer.
Yeah.
So, it means that if you are not sweating as much, your body is not cooling down. Your body is now stuck there because now this situation is very dangerous as well. That's why obviously hydration is such a hot topic where essentially we want to be well hydrated because we want the system to work well, but we don't want to be overhydrated. But in a situation where there is not enough fluid, what happens? We're not producing enough sweat. So our body is struggling to cool down because that cooling effect for sweat is not there. We are also struggling because our blood is now thicker, so the blood flow is reduced. So we are even warmer because that blood flow through our skin is no longer occurring. Of course, digestion is compromised, so it's very difficult to process food because there is no fluid helping with that. So that is why one of the main reasons that people start getting off from food is because the digestive tract is struggling as well. There is not enough fluids to support the whole system operating smoothly. So, and then of course, it's this overheating that is quite dangerous as well. So that's why if we can, from the start of the bacterial stay ahead of it in terms of like make sure that the body tries to stay as hydrated as possible without overdoing it, which is a tricky bit, it's going to be very helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a really good question. Any tips to avoid caffeine-induced reflux without removing the caffeine?
Well, this is the first time I hear of something like that. So, things that I would suggest doing, if one thing is that as much as caffeine is helpful, and there's of course tons of evidence showing how beneficial it can be, there is also evidence showing that there are some people who don't respond to caffeine, and even they can respond negatively. So, let's assume you're someone who sees the effect from caffeine. So you seriously see that caffeine helps, but you're having that issue. In that situation, I perhaps will look at dosifying the caffeine in way smaller portions. So it would be like, okay, what if we have those gummies that have like 5 milligrams of caffeine? So you have a few over the hour. That could be an option. But always my advice with caffeine, as much as it's helpful, if you're going through a period where essentially the few seconds it can save you or those extra benefit it can give you is at the cost of you having quite a miserable experience, I would say it's best to try and look for other options or avoid it in this situation, which I know is challenging when we're looking at bacterial trust where there's the sleep deprivation and other things that we need to cope with.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I haven't heard of it either, but I'm wondering, like, if it's something because after when I deep in backyard ultras, it's definitely something that happens to me. I get reflux, and it's after I've
Mm.
had caffeine. It's after I've. It's when tailwind tastes disgusting. I've tried taking quickies. It doesn't seem to work that well. But what are your thoughts about quickies?
I work with a couple of athletes who found it helpful in situations like that. But similar as the Imodium, I would be like, it's more like, okay, well, let's use this thing because we are getting to that point where it's nothing else we can do. So we try to get to that situation. With that, let's say, very well, I wouldn't say very likely. So if we're experiencing these situations of regurgitation and there are points where you are noticing a pattern, it would be like, okay, let's see what happened in the lead up. Let's analyze the strategy or how you are approaching your nutrition and see where are the gaps that we need to address to avoid getting to a point like that. So that would be something to look at. If we're already pinpointing that it's actually caffeine in this situation, is okay, should we explore maybe at least trying different options? So I mentioned those strips that you can put in your mouth. So in that case, maybe that's one. The other one could be low dose microdosing. So looking at that, if regardless of what you're doing is still there, then in that case, I will be like, you know what, let's try and skip it and see how the experience goes in that case.
Yeah, and skipping the caffeine, that would be really the only way to really pinpoint for 100% sure that it is the caffeine that's causing the reflux, right?
Hmm. Well, it will be the last thing to confirm it, right? Because, for
Yeah,
example, if you are aware that every time, regardless of how you're having it, you're having this, is like, well, it's very likely it's caffeine.
yeah,
But if you are like, oh, actually, when every time I have the caffeinated energy gel, I'm getting regurgitation. But that's also the only time you have an energy gel. It's like, oh, what if it's the energy gel, not necessarily the caffeine? Or it could be about maybe sometimes for some people, it's actually the flavor and how, like, especially for these are feedback I get from people when they are not comfortable drinking coffee or that's something that is not their thing.
mm,
They can taste quite strong the caffeine flavor in some energy gels. Whereas for me, it's like, oh, I don't even notice it because I'm having my coffee daily, so it doesn't feel like it. So for some people, it can be quite off-putting as well.
mm,
So yeah, it's I know that it's frustrating in the ultra world in general, that trial and error. I We try to avoid it as much as possible. So my role when I work with people is, okay, tell me what is the situation, hear exactly what's been going on, and based on their particular circumstances, present them with the options that from there they can explore. So that is way more narrow than just going into this massive load of information and trying to figure out from themselves. That, of course, that trial and error becomes extremely frustrating. So it's like, okay, we have here, and now that we have these narrow options, here's where it starts. And then that's where there are so many ways we can, let's say, cut the pie in terms of grams of carbohydrate, where you're getting it from, the distribution across the lab. So there are things that we can work with. And depending on, of course, how we're responding, we're getting to that strategy that it's adequate for this particular situation.
yeah. Very good. The last question that someone sent in was a good one. You offer two different programs. Can you please explain each one?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to promote myself. So, no, thank you for asking. So, yes, I offer two different programs. The Fuel to Excel program is my elite program, let's say. So, in that case, people who are ideal for a program like this will be one, they are at the top of their game and they just are looking for that extra competitive edge. And also someone, or actually not and, or someone who is having severe issues with their gut and they need 100% detailed personalized approach and nail this. Also very good for someone who is, you know what, Gaby, I just need you to tell me what to do. I don't have time to be putting this together myself, and I just need someone who is there with me all the way. The way that someone explained it, and I really love the way they say it, is like having me on their corner the whole time. And that's pretty much what that program does. The other program is my Fuel to Thrive Academy. And what this program is designed for is to give you everything you need. So at the end of 12 weeks, you have the knowledge, the tools, and the support to nail your nutrition in every context. Of course, knowing that this is geared to endurance. So it means that you have a successful race experience because you have the understanding in terms of how to put this nutrition together. You have my supervision in creating a really successful race plan, and you finish the program, and now you have a next event and you have the understanding of exactly how to tackle it, because it's pretty much me helping you nail the nutrition for yourself. So I love that program. I love how people are seeing the benefit of understanding the why and how of their nutrition and how it empowers them. That is the whole objective of it, is give you the power to master your nutrition. Someone who went through that program was Narchi, and I love seeing her at Sat Champs because she was so good at noticing when she needed to tweak things on her nutrition. She put that plan together, like we essentially built it together, and when she was going through it and she was starting to notice that things needed to change, she was well aware of like, oh, I need more sodium. Actually, I need to change the carbs. And like she had a really good understanding because she knew exactly what was the why behind every single thing that was there for her plan.
Yeah, awesome. And you've got spots available on both those plans at the moment?
Yes, so the Fuel to Thrive Academy is definitely open for enrollment. In the case of the Fuel to Excel, is submitting an application as well. There are limited spots available there, but yeah, essentially just get in touch. And the what I recommend is the best next move for someone will be book a call with me. You can do that directly from the website, and I help you understand which is the best program for you based on your needs and what exactly you are looking at achieving from your nutrition.
Yep, awesome. Now, last time you were on, I caught you a little bit off guard because I asked you if you've got any backyard ultras planned, and you said that you don't know. But now there's 12 months been. Like, where does that stand now?
Oh dear. So I knew you were going to ask that question actually.
Yeah.
Now I do have some good news, and I think first I'm someone who it takes me so long to essentially build to things because I feel like, and this is I think I mentioned this last time, I owe it to everybody in the sport because I have so much to expect for it that I put my effort and dedication in getting to a point where it's building towards the next step. So the good news is that this year I registered for my first trail run. So I'm doing Transcend in August. Now I'm doing Transcend 28K because Transcend is 65K as well. But yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to. So at this pace, I'll say that my first backyard ultra likely will be 2026.
Okay, awesome.
So
That's good.
yes, but yeah, like definitely. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, I've been doing triathlon for such a long time, and I've been doing essentially road running for pretty much 20 years. So actually on Thursday, I went for my first trail run, and it was obviously quite a different experience. I love having that time running with other people in the trail run community here in Perth, and I definitely enjoy it a lot. But I could tell that if I want to do this right, I definitely would rather take my time and build to it. I know that, of course, it's very different doing a point to point versus a backyard ultra. Of course, depending, for example, if I choose, let's say, here this here, the surface is way more gentle than if I go into a rural trail run that is quite technical. So, of course, it's going to be different. But yeah, I'm sure that, okay, actually, let's put it 2026
Okay, awesome.
is where I'm getting my first backyard ultra.
Unreal. Well, thanks heaps for coming on again. It's been so informative and helpful, and I reckon everyone listening will agree with that. So, yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch, like I'll tag you your Instagram on the Instagram post, so they'll be able to find you. And it was great meeting you in person at the Sat Champs as well. That was really fun.
Yeah, it was so good. I had such a good time there, and it was also great to meet you in person. I mean, like obviously because we have this in video, I obviously knew what your face looked like and it looks like and everything. But yeah, it's definitely different to have that interaction in person and to be so close to the action as well. That definitely was quite a good experience.
Yeah, it was great. Well, thanks again. Don't go anywhere. I'll hit stop on the recording. But thanks again.